I was invited to talk about horror stories today. So I will actually not give my original talk about sharing is caring, but instead I will reframe it a little in telling open scholarship horror stories today, given that, that we have the Halloween event. And I will open my personal ideographic file drawer of all the horrors that I have witnessed over the last couple of years. Trigger warning, some of the stuff is pretty heavy. And that's meant to be a joke, but it has been frustrating to me in part, experience these things. So I will do this as a common therapy session, and I thank all of you for helping me getting through these terrible open scholarship experiences that I've seen in the last few years. So I will talk about transparency today, and I want to define this as the quality that makes it possible to see through something. And if we look at the academic literature or science as a whole, as Gauri has pointed out just now, often when we want to look at something in a transparent way, all that stares back at us is a skeleton looking out of a closet. And we're left wondering what is underneath that, because we don't see what we want to see. There are 5 or 6 topics that one could easily talk about when it comes to transparency. The most commonly talked about in our field are open papers, open access, and open data. I will not talk about those because many people here will know about these topics. They will care about these topics. Instead, I'm going to talk about measurement, editorial decisions, and theories from a transparency perspective. And I hope that's more interesting for some of you, because I don't see much debate on these issues in the literature or on Twitter. So yeah, maybe that's useful at all. All right. So I'll start with measurement transparency, and I'll tell you a little story. 6 years ago, I met Jessica Flake, whom you can see here in this little comic, on Twitter. And it turns out we were both working on trying to understand practices in measurement in psychology from the perspective of transparency. And a friend of mine, Farina, ended up making this little comic about it. And it's the shortest version of this story, so I'll just show it here. And you can see this cave with measurement, and we ventured forth and saw a number of dark places over the years collaborating on this. And eventually we identified anything from nefarious practices over sort of innocent practices that were really problematic, but probably without nefarious intent, to lots of other issues. And in the end, we decided that we wanted to tell everyone about these experiences, which resulted in the paper called Measurement on questionable measurement practices in social sciences and how to avoid them. And the term QMP, questionable measurement practices, is defined as a decision somebody makes in academia or in research that raises doubts about the validity of the measures used in a study. And of course, if the measurement doesn't work out, well, how can you trust your results, your conclusions, your inferences? Measurement is really at the foundation, at least in empirical work, to statistical conclusion. Giving you an example here, this is a paper, and I don't know the authors. I take no issue with this particular paper. It's just really one example, and I have many of those today. They use the SSPS scale, doesn't really matter what it is. And it usually is one score on the scale, and the authors split up the scale into positive and negative score, and they find a significant effect. I question whether they had planned this from the get-go or they p-hacked their results to get a significant finding in some way. I don't know the truth. It might have been pre-registered in their heads, and it might be the right thing to do here, but there's lack of transparency, so I simply don't know. I don't have sufficient information. This practice is questionable because I have questions. And you've all seen the Garden of Working Paths, of course. So what could have happened here, although I have no evidence for this, researchers often use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scales, dependent measures for their study, for their outcome. Maybe they tried one scale, they removed a bunch of items, they tried a second scale using a sum score or a principal components analysis. Then they tried the third score with a one sum score, and then they broke the subscales apart into negative and positive SSPS, and then they found a significant effect. Again, I don't know. I have no evidence this is true, but I also have no evidence to the contrary. And this is unusual what they did here. So I have questions. I do not trust the validity of this study. I'm going to give you another example, master's thesis of Linus Neumann, who worked with me a year ago. The Hamilton rating scale for depression from 1960 is one of the 50 most cited papers across all sciences ever. I hope that shows you that the scale is used a lot in research. And it might not surprise you that the Hamilton scale, that usually has 17 questions, exists in 30 different versions, all the way from 6 questions to 38 questions. And each of these exists in dozens of versions because they're translated into many scales. So you have over 1,000 versions of the Hamilton scale in the literature. And we recently randomly drew 100 papers on the Hamilton scale from famous or prominent clinical journals. And we found that only 40% of them told us what particular scale they're using of the Hamilton scale. That's a huge issue, of course. I don't need to tell you this, given that results might well not replicate across different lengths of scales, different translations, languages, cultural backgrounds, and so forth. But we have no way to tell what scale they use. They just simply don't tell us, which pollutes the literature. A last issue talking about measurement is financial interests here. And this is something that I really find quite upsetting. Some of you might know the story. If not, I recommend you look it up. It's a paper, article in Science, 2017. I have the link down here. So the authors here, two people, published a scale in 2006 on treatment adherence. And ever since, they've been writing emails to, quote from the article, demand payments of as much as tens of thousands of dollars each from hundreds of researchers for scale use for these 8 questions. And there have been several retractions as a consequence, often from scholars from the global south, because I mean, I couldn't afford tens of thousands of dollars for using 8 items for my work. Although I'm funded by the European Union and our institute has some money, but that's not feasible. And now you think, Eiko, probably the scale is super important and patented and there are good reasons for this. No, these people just ask a bunch of questions about treatment adherence. Do you sometimes forget to take your medication? Is that worth several $10,000? Questionable. I might get in trouble for publishing these items here. I'm not even sure how this works, because in the US you can copyright questionnaires and you can make private money from those, even though your research is funded by public funds, taxpayer money, and so forth. It's really quite bizarre. So this is not illegal what the authors are doing here. I think it's just super sketchy, personally. This lack of transparency leads to problems. This copyright leads to lots of problems in the literature. And again, this is one example. We have dozens or hundreds of scales in psychology with this issue. It's very normal to copyright your measures. So I looked up the psychometric properties yesterday of the scale. And well, it turns out I can't find much information because you're not allowed to reprint the content of the scale in scientific papers. So this paper simply says question 1, question 2, question 3, making it unclear what they measured and how they used the scale. One personal story from 2 days ago. I am currently conducting a study and we want to use a 3-item questionnaire, the mini spin. And so I wrote the author of the mini spin who said, well, you need to pay $800 to use the mini spin. And to put this into context, for our 90-minute survey, if I, for each 3 items, pay $800, that's about $150,000 for 90 minutes of questionnaires. Just to show you how absurd that is to ask $800 for a question like this. Further, they wanted me to sign a legal agreement, that I could not reprint the 3 items from the scale and make them accessible. Meaning that if I were to use this in my research, I could not tell other researchers what measures I have in my study, which is very bizarre from an open scholarship perspective. Okay, if you want to increase your transparency of measures, we have 6 questions for you in our paper with Jessica Flake. And if you don't follow these, Jessica Flake will come after you and you will have a terrible Halloween. So you better follow these practices. All right, second point, looking at the time, editorial decisions and reviews. I'll make this short. We tried to publish a paper and the reviews were quite positive on this paper, but the paper was rejected by the editor. And so this is the rejection letter. Confidential comments from the reviewers indicate that a revised version of this manuscript would unlikely be acceptable. So in other words, the editor claims that the reviewers told them something in private that has some sort of scholarly impact that makes our paper not publishable. So that really set me back. I thought, oh God, what could that be? What did I do wrong? What is wrong with my paper? I followed up with the editor to ask about the process. It's kind of weird to me that in a scientific debate on the merits of a manuscript, I'm not told what the problem here is. And the editor doubled down and said, I checked again and the comments are really crucial. So there's nothing I can do for you. So I felt terrible about that. I thought about what to do. I put it on Twitter. I shared it with my colleagues on Twitter. Said, this happened to me. Does anybody have thoughts on this? Maybe I did something wrong. I would an anonymous reviewer. This is anonymous. The journals I publish in are the reviewers. I don't know their identity. So why wouldn't they share their concerns with me as a researcher rather than just with the editor? And then I concluded I could just let it go. Maybe there's a good reason for this. This might happen once in a lifetime, just drop it. And you probably see where this story is going. Somebody reached out to me the next day on Twitter and said, the same happened to me at the same journal with the same editor. My paper was also rejected due to confidential comments from reviewers. And I'll leave it to you guys to conclude what that means, but I personally have not since submitted a paper to BBI, and I will also continue not submitting papers there in the future. Similar story, different journal of Affective Disorders. Write a paper. Both reviewers are quite positive. The editor rejects the paper. I appeal. I say, but both reviewers were really positive. What's going on here? I wrote this kind, friendly, long email repeal. And the editor said, we cannot accept your appeal. In this case, both reviewers suggested for rejection. And long story short, I remembered that one of the reviewers had signed his review. I reached out to him and he said, here's a screenshot, Eiko. I said minor revision, not rejection. Now, these are minor stories. They don't matter on the whole of science, of course. The point here is that these things, I've been doing this for 10 years and you see these things over and over again. And I think it's a real problem, especially not for people like me. I have tenure now. I'm a white dude with all the privilege you can have in my position. I'll be okay. But this can be weaponized against early career people. This can be weaponized for the wrong reasons, for I don't know, racial reasons or gender bias reasons or other reasons. And this lack of transparency is a real big problem, I think. The last point, Joanne, how much time do I have left? I can skip this if I'm running out of time.
2 minutes.
That's important. I can do 2 minutes.
Yeah.
The last point is the last point is lack of transparency in theories. And you might say, well, what do you mean, Eiko? Well, in our field, theories are often narrative and vague. They're imprecise and unclear. They're written up verbally. And so it's hard to me to see what the researchers are actually claiming, what they're theorizing about. Paul Meehl said that theories sort of just tend to neither be refuted or corroborated. They just fade away as people lose interest. And so we've done a lot of work in the last couple of years, along with many other people, calling for more formal theories where you were actually forced to write down what you think about your theory, in the best case in equations, and then you can make clear predictions from that. So maybe the problem in two comics, I call this a hidden theory, where it's sort of hard to see what the researcher actually predicts. And then the data come in, and to me as a reader, the data neither supports nor contradicts the theory, but the researcher claims it's confirmed. And then equally bad is a vague theory, where there's some sort of theory, but it's more like a theory. And the data to me as a reader says clearly the theory is not confirmed. And then the theorist finds all sorts of excuses in psychology. People like the excuse hidden moderator, but there are many more. Let's skip this stuff. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to send this to you. Conclusion, lack of transparency is everywhere. Papers, data, code measures release theories, and so on. This lack of transparency facilitates questionable research practices and also helps to hide fraud, which happens. And I think perhaps even more importantly, it can be weaponized within existing processes or systems that are not transparent in biased and unfair ways, which is where open scholarship as an egalitarian tool comes in. Last slide. Like Gowri, I want to say there are issues with transparency. Transparency will not solve all our problems, and there are reasonable concerns that young scholars sign their reviews, for example, for fear of retaliation. There are many other issues than transparency that matter, but transparency also matters, and we need more transparency. We will on average improve academia and open scholarship. Very last slide, I'm sorry, Joanne. Many people are working really hard on this. I just found this funny footnote in a paper from 1950 where this person says, you know, if you want to see my computer code, send me a letter per mail. I will send you my computer code. So people have been working on reproducible, open, transparent science for a long time. And just yesterday, the NWO announced many scholarships on open science, many grants that will help with transparency. So there's lots of good stuff as well after all these horror stories. Thanks, John, and thanks to all my collaborators and students and so on for helping me develop these things.